Let me just start off by welcoming everybody. So I'm Chris Danks. Let me start by giving you a quick introduction to the Leadership Collective, our speakers here today, and also the agenda. For those of you that don't know, the Leadership Collective is a free community for HR professionals and leaders. The community offers you basically 5 ways that we can help you. So one is peer-to-peer events, just like this one. We also do a lot of other formats of, different types of events as well, and also in-person events. We also have a content platform which allows you access to a variety of different content. Most of you here are HR professionals, so we do a lot of content relevant to HR professionals and HR leaders as well in different formats. And then we have a WhatsApp and a Slack group as well, which allows people to collaborate and help each other with different challenges on a sort of day-to-day basis. We also provide expert advisory in a variety of different areas, supporting you with international expansion, lots of kind of typical HR related challenges and thought leadership, that kind of thing. So we're here to kind of support with that. And then finally, we have the last but not least, the recruitment solution, which is across 66 countries now. We help organizations expand internationally in conjunction with the Recruitment Network, which James Osborne here is the founder and CEO of, who I'm just about to introduce. That's just a little bit about what we do here at the Leadership Collective. Let me reintroduce you to Hamish Taylor and also Megan Nicol. So for many of you, you would have seen them both on the HRCI event back in August. Hamish is a speaker and advisor in customer-led transformations in particular, which is going to be his specialist subject for this conversation as well. Hamish is the former CEO of the Channel Tunnel Railway, Eurostar, as well as Sainsbury's Bank, and worked with British Airways, PwC, among many others. And Megan here, who I can see somewhere on my screen, is the VP of People and Culture at Redlen Technologies, based over in Canada, and has over 15 years of experience in various HR leadership roles. And I'll also mention has the CPHR certification through HRCI as well. Also, finally, last but not least, let me introduce James, who I mentioned. So James wasn't on the HRCI event, but has kindly joined us today. And James is the CEO and founder of the Recruitment Network, which is basically a global community of recruitment organizations. So TRN, or the Recruitment Network, provide recruiters on a global basis with different tools, content, training, and insights to kind of help them really reach their potential as recruitment experts in different fields. So that's James. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Just very quickly before we get into the content, the agenda for today. So James is going to spend a few minutes talking about a number of key themes related to executive hiring. Some of them we will have covered a little bit on the HRCI event, particularly on the section that I did myself. However, James is going to talk around some other stuff, and also we're going to kind of go into a bit more depth because we were quite limited on time last time. So James is going to kind of expand that out a little bit. And then Hamish and Megan will give their thoughts, and then we'll open it up to a discussion to the rest of the group as well. So I just want to mention it is an interactive session. So if it's possible for you, it'd be great to keep the cameras on so we can see who you are and really, really get the discussion going, I guess. Do put questions in the chat. I know some of you are in the chat already, and do speak up. Any particular questions, thoughts, challenges, comments you might have about the subject of executive hiring, I'm sure would really help others. So feel free to get involved. Finally, I'm just going to attempt to share my screen here. I just want to share with you a QR code for those of you here today, but also anyone watching on the recording. So if you click on this QR code, you will be able to set up a conversation with Hamish. If you want to talk to him about, particularly around the HR customer-led transformation piece that Hamish is going to talk a bit about today. If you want to join our free community, then you can also do so by clicking on this link. And finally, if you need a recruitment partner, particularly in the exec search world, you can click a box and either James or I will help guide you to the relevant experts in your particular vertical or niche and geography as well, in partnership with the Recruitment Network, who have a large amount of highly trusted executive search members within the community. So I think that's about it from me. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and I will pass over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you all today, and those of you on the call. I'm going to just run through a couple of slides. Actually, I've got quite a few slides, but I talk very quickly, so they'll feel like a couple of slides. And I'm just going to run through some ideas to get the thinking going, I suppose, and get the conversation going about a few different areas. Some of the stuff that I know Chris has touched on with you before, but I suppose I'm going to give you my sort of perspective and my angle on it, if that's okay. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully that's popped up okay and you can see my screen okay. And as I say, as an organization with the Recruitment Network, we work with hundreds and hundreds of recruitment organizations and staffing firms around the world. So it gives us a really nice helicopter view of what's going on around staffing and around recruitment and around all sorts of areas for that matter. And one of the things that we like to talk a lot about is around talent and around every aspect of talent. So whether it comes to hiring, engagement, motivation, retention, redeployment, retraining, et cetera, of talent. And I think that whole piece is incredibly important. And one of those pieces, which I think links to what we're going to talk about today, which is around sort of senior level hiring, is around how do you get more out of your people? How do you motivate people better? And the leaders we're bringing into our businesses, do they have the skills, the capability to be able to ignite motivation within people? And I suppose is the way of looking at it. So I'm going to quickly touch on that and put a bit of a backdrop to it. And hopefully that will get the conversation going and some thinking going. So I'll run through the slides first, and then we'll open up to a bit of a debate, I suppose. And I think if we look at, certainly in the UK, certainly in many parts of the world, the last 12 to 18 months has been quite an interesting time for many parts of the world. I think one of the things that we've learned a lot about is, and probably the hard way in some instances, is about our people. What are the types of people that work well in our businesses in different types of economical climates and different types of markets? And I think the reality we're facing as a global economy is that we go through a series of what we refer to as VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the reality now is we're just used to transacting and trading and existing in volatile markets and volatile world, sadly, with the wars going on and the economic changes and everything else. But what we've learned is there are some people who are really good at that and some people who are not so good at working in those sorts of environments. You add in another factor as well, is that we now have, for the very first time in our history, as far as I know, we now have a truly multi-generational workplace where we now have up to 5 different generations all working out in the same offices. So it's a really interesting time to be a leader where we've got volatile markets. We're trying to squeeze more performance and productivity out of our people. We've got multi-generations to actually work with and try and motivate and inspire. How do you do all that as a leader? And then most importantly, when we're talking about hiring, how do we find leaders who can do that? Because obviously that's absolutely key moving forward. Now, I see this as a big opportunity as much as anything else, because those organizations around the world who are finding that senior level C-suite leadership team who have the ability to really drive employee engagement in a very extraordinary, let's call it a complex world, I think are going to be absolute winners. Now, to help understanding that, we did a survey a few months ago called Ignite, where we wanted to identify across multi-generations, basically what is it that really drives motivation at the moment as much as anything else, to help leaders within businesses understand what they need to do better to be able to engage, motivate, support, and drive increased productivity and performance across their workforces. Now, obviously, these will be different in different organizations and different workforces and different marketplace. But the general principle is that we broke our report down and our assessment down into these areas, because these are the areas we think that drive motivation or impact motivation and engagement as much as anything else, whether it be down to my career progression, work-life balance, which is a huge subject again here in the UK at the moment, rewards and recognition, down to things like your purpose and impact as an employee within a business, and how you actually collaborate and interact with different generations, etc. So what we wanted to identify is what is it that really motivates people, and then what are leaders doing to try and drive that through as part of their initiative. I'm very happy to share the results with you all afterwards if you're interested to see it, because it is quite a fascinating insight. And I won't go through all the results now, but what we looked at were things like across the group and across all of the groups, what was it that motivates people most to do their best work? And interestingly enough, some of the things that we were expecting to see quite high, such as things like positive impact on society and the planet, were actually a hell of a lot lower now. So we're seeing a big shift now in what people are saying is what's really important to them. So we'll identify what really motivates people to do their best work. And then on the flip side of that, we then asked them to show us how satisfied they were in each of those different areas. And again, what we started to identify, there's a huge gap between what people are saying really drives their motivation and inspires them at work, and what they're actually getting from their leadership team and from their employers as well. Now, again, I'm very, very fascinated to understand across some of your markets what you're seeing across your businesses as well. And again, I'm very happy to share the report with Chris, and he can share it to everybody on the call today. So what we identified is that I don't think leaders are necessarily creating disengagement within their businesses. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I do think there are many who are just not creating enough engagement. So we've got people who are coming to work because they sort of have to, and they're sort of coasting when they get there as opposed to delivering more. And I think that's the big part of a leader's role is how do we create more and get more out of it. Some of the themes that came out of the survey, I'll touch on these very quickly. My development was one of the top of the 3 motivators. We always see that. So people's ability to learn and grow and develop and get more. The organizational vision and the positive impact it's making on society actually scored much lower than we had anticipated based on previous reports. So there's definitely been a shift. And part of that, certainly here in the UK, would be linked towards the cost of living crisis and the fact that people don't have as much money in their pockets anymore. About 40% of respondents felt very dissatisfied with their salary and their remuneration and their benefits and felt there could be an improvement with that. Stability and the people they work with came out as being one of the key areas that respondents were really satisfied with. So they loved the flexibility coming out of the post-COVID period. They loved the people they were working with, which is great. The number one area where there's the biggest level of unsatisfaction, however, was leadership, ironically enough. And again, I don't think that's probably new to anybody, but it's fascinating when you start seeing it come out time and time again within data, which I think is always quite interesting. So we've got these multi-generational workplaces that does impact what drives motivation and engagement in any business. And our ability to understand that and adapt to that accordingly is obviously very critical. One of the things that we often talk about with leaders across some of the businesses that we work with is, this expression's come out a lot at the moment when recruiters are working with their customers, their hiring customers, talking about the types of people they're looking for in their next role. And they're saying, well, I don't really want this younger generation because they're just lazy. They don't really have that old work ethic that we used to have type thing. And I think we've got to be very careful with statements like that because I don't think it's true. What we should be saying instead is what could we do to help that younger generation have a work ethic that aligns with what we are looking for within our businesses, as opposed to just saying it's different from us and therefore it doesn't work. Again, interestingly, when you go through the results of the report, which again, I'm happy to share, you'll start seeing different results based on the different demographics and the different age groups, whether it be the early Gen Z, the millennials, the early millennials, et cetera, et cetera. So we have different motivations and different drivers and that we need to understand and be able to adapt to. So the question then becomes with this multi-generational leadership, how do you manage someone who's years, decades older or younger than you potentially? And this is a really interesting paradox and challenge for many business leaders at the moment is how do they adapt their engagement motivation style? Now, do we have a carte blanche approach or do we have to flex it and make it adapted to it depending on the different people within our businesses? Having a one size fits all style I don't think necessarily works anymore. And that's the reality. And there's a fantastic guy who's Dr. Paul Redmond. You may be familiar with Dr. Paul Redmond's work about generations and how to adapt and work with different generations. And he quite rightly states that being inconsistent now is the secret to managing multiple generations. In other words, you can't be consistent and do the same thing with everyone. You have to adapt it to different types of people and different generations within your businesses. Makes a lot of sense, I suppose, in principle. Some of you may be familiar with the self-determination theory, the Decky and Ryan concept. If you look at traditional motivational methodologies, we've always talked about carrots and sticks as the old school way of doing it. Carrots being if I reward someone for something, I generally get more of those behaviors that I wanted. Sticks being if I punish someone for something, I may get less of the behaviors I didn't want in the first place. So that's the traditional way that leaders try to motivate people in businesses typically. I think that's a little bit archaic now. And I think fortunately people are starting to realize that now. But the Deck and Ryan principle, which is around the self-determination theory of motivation, throws that all out the window in essence. And try to understand the best way to get people to perform tasks that they really want to do outside of just rewarding them with carrots necessarily. And the principle behind the self-determination theory is that motivation is intrinsic when an activity is driven by inherent satisfactions provided by the actual activity itself, not by something external that we put on it, as in a stick, negative, or a positive carrot type stuff. In other words, you've got to get people to basically really want to do something if you want to drive motivation. It's sort of a fairly obvious thing to say, the way to look at it, but just by putting incentives in front of people or sticks where you're going to disincentivize people for doing the wrong thing is not necessarily a way to drive motivation anymore. This is a really nice, I think, way of describing that when you look at people at one end who are not self-determined, where they've got no desire to do something, or at best they are sort of just told to do it, so they get on with it, et cetera, et cetera. And on the right-hand end of the spectrum, you've got people who just love, literally in love with their day job and what they do. They want to do more because it feels good for them, et cetera. And that intrinsic motivation is the piece that really, really makes the difference. And leaders need to have the ability to drive that within their workforce as much as they possibly can. So Again, if you separate that out into a very simple sort of graphic, people engage with an activity or behavior because it's inherently interesting. It's not because there's a tangible reward. So it becomes something that's they're passionate about, it's interesting, it raises their curiosity, they enjoy it maybe, it maybe does drive purpose, it's fun for them, as opposed to the extrinsic stuff, which is more around praise and punishment and kudos and money, and so it goes on and so it goes on. So two very different ways of looking at that. And that really aligns well, I think, to what we're seeing about how employees and what they're asking for now, not only to come and work for you in your businesses, not only to stay in your businesses, but actually to work hard when they get there as well, which I think is key. And this line is what we're saying to people, is that we need to get people to fall in love with what they do. It's as simple as that. And some of you may be familiar with the Ikigai concept. I think, Chris, you may have even mentioned this at the previous session. I absolutely love Ikigai because I think it is absolutely the echelon of what drives motivation in anyone, myself, leaders, and et cetera, et cetera. And I can't help thinking that great leaders of today are fixated and obsessed about helping people find their Ikigai in their jobs. And I think it's a wonderful way of looking at it, ideally, which is great. So we know people perform better when they're motivated. And I think your business will perform better when your people perform better, fairly obvious. But everyone in your business is different. So every generation has different beliefs about what work and what they like and what motivates them. And therefore, good leadership is about understanding those different motivations of your people and creating an environment that allows those individual motivators to really thrive. Motivation is not just about incentivizing people to do things, but more about getting people to actually fall in love with what they're doing. So they want to do it more and they want to do it continuously. And why we call it Ignite is because it's about igniting their true passions inside. So therefore, that all makes sense. I think we all understand that's a principle, and there'll be nuances with different markets and different businesses. But then this then leads into how do we then recruit leaders who can deliver this, because that's now business critical, right? We've got to be able to deliver this piece. And this is where we then start talking about how do you assess, how do you find, how do you source great leaders, people who are going to come into your businesses that can demonstrate those behaviors, that can be multi-generational leaders and drive greater motivations. And the way we segment this in recruitment terms are what we call signs and samples. You may be familiar with this as a concept, but when you assess a leader, you can basically split your assessments into two different categories. One's are signs, which are indicators like personality or judgment, and samples, which are actual observed behaviors. And I'm not sure, Chris, if you've ever had these conversations with your collective at all about signs and samples as an example, but signs provide the data that can indicate potential, but they require inference. So samples are more of a direct view of how a leader performs in real world scenarios, very similar to how we have behavioral based assessments over just purely sort of psychometric testing as an example. So then we start talking about what are the signs and samples of each of these different things. And I'm just going to very quickly share a couple of these, and I'll stop talking then and hand it over as a conversational starter, I suppose, is some example samples that recruiters, C-suite recruiters, executive recruiters utilize in order to be able to identify the traits of great leaders. As an example, reference checking, we talk a lot about, but how many of you do actual 360-degree reference checking, for example? So we're speaking to not only someone's peers, but also their supervisors, also their subordinates. So we're painting this complete picture of a senior level hire, as an example. Maybe looking at things like panel interviews, but with cross-functional stakeholders. So rather than interviewing people about a particular leader and about their skill set, look at different departments that they've had to interact with as part of their job. And what does that tell you about their ability to engage with different stakeholders within a business and within an organization as well? Things like situational judgment tests, where you can actually place candidates in a hypothetical scenario that would mirror a real challenge that they may face working in your organization, but particularly important, where your cultural objectives would be tested. So what's the scenario where actually it would really assess and test your culture, your value set, and everything else, and assess them against those in a situational judgment. And then from there, you can then start producing some fantastic data and reports. You could use AI to start analyzing these reports for you, where you can start really understanding what are the skills matrix and the needs matrix you need to have within the business, looking at data and looking at real life scenarios as well. So that's what I wanted to kick off today with, was to get the conversation going about, actually, when I look at assessing leaders, it's as much about looking at their skills as their ability to drive different types of behaviors with different generations within businesses. And I think that requires a whole load of nuances and different types of ways of assessing, searching, sourcing, and engaging with leadership team. So, Chris, I'd be interested in your thoughts about that to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, James. That was great. First thought that springs to mind in my experience is that the weighting is often very heavily towards, background and skills. And I think that's true across executive hiring, but also across hiring in general, where people will naturally gravitate towards that. Where I think it gets more interesting is how you balance, cultural fit, the behavioral side, and how you actually spend a bit of time creating the matrix in the first place to understand exactly what's important for those, for the leaders that you need within that organization, and how you weight those different components based on the needs of the organization and the needs within that role. And I think that, in my experience, that's something that's maybe not always implemented in the most optimal way. I think people naturally gravitate towards background rather than looking at other elements. Yeah. So, I mean, what's your view, James? In your experience, how would you go about sort of creating the weighting and looking at the, before you even get into the process, to establish, what the really important factors are for any given executive role? Like, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I look at past performance not as a predictor of future potential. I think there's a difference between the two. I think past performance tells you what somebody has done in the past in certain environments. It doesn't tell you what they potentially could do in your environment. So that's where that cultural alignment piece is so important. Every workplace is completely different. Your workplace is different. So where Amy works, where Kimberly works, where Frina works, these workplaces are completely significantly different. The people within those are very different as well. So you've got to look at where the business that you're going into is going, what's the culture of those business, or the value sets of those business that drives that business. And then you look at those predictors and the behavioral assessments we talked about, those real life scenarios that can say, actually, well, how would you fit in this particular scenario? What you did then may not be the same thing. I mean, Hamish, you must have seen this across the organizations that you've worked with in the past around how can you tell when you've got someone that's got a CV and it says all this about them, but how can you actually tell what they're going to be tomorrow when they come into your door? And you're on mute. Yeah.
Look, of course it's difficult. And I think, my biggest failures have been not being able to do that. And I think, what I find interesting in this is that I wonder if we start in the wrong place sometimes when we think about candidates or recruitment. And we're starting in the wrong place when we think about candidates and recruitment. Because actually, for me, the starting point should be my success. Let me explain. Customer-led transformation that I work with is all about your success is not about you, it's about how you interact with the world around you. So the whole idea in products and services is you start with what's the benefit to the customer, and then let's work back towards what do we need to be good at then to enable that success. So for me, the starting point for this is, well, what does success look like for the person who is recruiting? What do I want? So for me, it's about understanding my world properly and understand, because before you can decide the proposition for what it is you're trying to do, you need to understand the world and the environment with which it's going to be, as you rightly said. So what kind of things would I want to know if I was recruiting somebody to work for me? What would I think that you should know as a recruiter then if somebody's coming in to work for me? Yes, of course, you need to find out about what are my business challenges and what are my business goals and who are my customers and what pressures am I under from, whoever else, the chairman or whatever. But I think the biggest one is the one you've touched on, which is understanding the ability to do a job in my culture. I mean, I failed horribly in trying to recruit brand managers into Procter & Gamble. Why? Because I was convinced I needed executives who understood customer centricity, because that's what we're trying to do in this operationally led airline. We want, people to understand the customer. But the problem is, if you come out of Unilever or Mars or somewhere like that, yes, you understand brand management and customer centricity, but it's much easier to achieve it in a place like Mars or Unilever, where it is basically a customer-led business. When you come into an operationally led business like BA, where instead of, Unilever, the whole operation is built around the brand manager. At BA, it wasn't. You had to go out there and you had to influence people. You did not have the line management, gravitas, if you like, to do it. You had to go and persuade people. And if you can't do that, it doesn't matter how good a brand manager you are, how good your technical skills are, you're going to fail. So, yeah, I think as a recruiter, you've got to, if you're recruiting, if I'm asking you to come in and recruit for me, you've got to come in and understand what it's like to do business in my world, not just what are the technical skills that I'm looking for in a recruit. You probably need to understand me as well as the person who's going to be managing this person. What do you know about me? What do people know about me at Eurostar? If I was recruiting a new director in Eurostar, what would they know about me? They'd know my background's in brand management, so I'm going to have big gaps in my knowledge in technical areas. I'm half owned by the government. I've got to deal with government officials. I've never done that before. I'm new to the railway industry. This is my first chief exec job. There was loads of things about me that were very relevant to the kind of support I was going to need to succeed. So my view is the starting point should be if you were recruiting, what does success look like for Hamish? What is the important parts of success for Hamish? And then let's work backwards from there into what kind of support does he need? And therefore, what should the candidate spec be? But start with the end result of my success, because the only reason I'm recruiting is because I want to be successful. So start with that definition of my success and work backwards.
Can I ask a question on that? And Chris, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump in on this one, if that's all right. I might actually ask Megan this question, if that's okay. When you bring in senior level people into a business, what do you think is more important, the leader molding and adapting to the business they're coming into, or the business adapting and molding to allow the leader to thrive in that business?
Well, great question. You go first, Megan. You take it away.
No. Okay, I was just going to say it's an impossible question, really, because every situation is so unique. But
Sure.
I think very truly the currency of modern leadership is adaptability, and that has to come from all parties in both arenas. And so when we think about executive recruiting, we think about it as a future exercise. So I totally agree with your point, James, that, the background and experience that someone brings is table stakes. We get that. That's what's on your resume, understood. Yeah. But looking forward, how do we create a future of success? And so creating as an organization, some of the competencies, we can create a matrix, etc. But at the end of the day, sometimes the best executive hiring comes from the surprises outside of that matrix. So we have to be adaptable, as does the candidate. And when we talk about modern leadership and who we're hiring to bring on to build our company into the future, we talk about when you're a manager of 5 people, you are 5 different managers, and you have to be 5 different managers. If you're a manager of 200 people, you have to be 200 different managers. And so we really value the currency of, therefore, communication, change management, adaptability. Those are modern leadership currencies that we value.
I would agree that particularly your point about it's got to come from both directions, because I think if I look at my experience, I went in as an agent of change effectively when I went into the airline or the railway or whatever. And I had to adapt to that environment. So I had to recognize that I don't have the same power base in British Airways or Eurostar that I had at Procter & Gamble. Equally, the airline or the railway had to want my kind of skill set. So they had to adapt and recognize that, what they were recruiting was somebody who was going to challenge the status quo within their environment. And that's, I think, quite an important point, because a lot of organizations talk about, we want change, we want an agent of change, a catalyst or whatever. Do they really? I think there's a real important thing to make sure they actually really want to be challenged and want to adapt. Now, I was recruited into Eurostar because they wanted somebody that would challenge the standard railway way of doing things. The board changed in Eurostar a few years after I left. The current board of Eurostar would never employ me because I would be because they don't have that same ambition for change. And that may be right or wrong. I'm not criticizing saying whether that's the right or wrong ambition. I'm just saying it's a different mindset. So you've got to understand the mindset, I think, that the organization has for whether it wants that change or not. And it's the same between generations. We spend our time being told we've got to understand the new generation coming through, with the attention span of a gnat, and they want your job tomorrow and all that sort of stuff. Well, babe, I have said to a bunch of young graduates actually recently, I said, I know you want my job tomorrow, but given that it's me that decides whether you get my job tomorrow, don't you think it'd be great if your generation spent a bit more time understanding mine as well as working the other way?
Hey, Rich, I was just going to ask you on that point. So you're talking kind of retrospectively, but now we live in such a new world where you could probably argue the last 3 or 4 years of business is so different than pretty much any other time. How do you apply the methodology that you were just talking about, starting with the customer, where we are now, where there's not really a sort of big track record of how business is kind of done today and the 5 generations that James was talking about? How do you apply that to sort of today, if that makes sense, today's business?
Very much. I don't think it matters what generation you're at or what state you're at. It's some very simple principles that says, if you want to succeed, it's based on enhancing the success of the other party. So the party that is recruiting you, it wants to succeed. So that's the recruitment spec. It's to help me succeed. So you've got to spend your time understanding what it is, what success looks like for me before you can even start thinking about what the spec of the person is or what kind of person you need. So it's about spending time really understanding your customer's world, I think. And you're right, Chris. Yeah, that has changed over time. But it doesn't negate the need to still understand how that organization sees it. Because, we as outsiders can see lots of businesses and what's going on. But in a particular business that is recruiting, they will have a particular view of the world and will be at a particular stage of adopting new technologies or whatever it is. But you need to understand that to know what kind of person will best fit with it.
Mm-hmm. Just coming back to something, James, that you said earlier as well, sort of linked to this, is you were talking about understanding 5 generations and motivations and all that kind of thing. I'm just curious on everyone's view around, motivation has always been clearly a very important thing to measure. You want the people in there that you talked about, the Ikigai model, James, and so on. But has that become even more important now because of some of the recent changes to culture in the workforce and the different generations and so on?
I think hugely. I think the world is a very, very different place than it was 3 to 5 years ago. And I think it's going to be a very, very different place in another 3 to 5 years' time. I don't think people have really, really accepted that. I think we've gone down the route of, let's use COVID as an example. I'm not afraid to talk about COVID, even though it was a few years ago now. But the reality is it changed the world significantly. And a lot of things, new habits that were created haven't gone back and they won't go back. And they've now become really important to some people. And if we use the example over here in the UK, where we've got big debates again at the moment about work-life balance and working hours and should people be in an office or not in an office. You're seeing it in the US where organizations are dragging their staff back into the office again 5 days a week. Are they doing that because they really want them back in the office 5 days a week? Are they doing that because it's a good way of whittling people out and saving having to make redundancies because et cetera, et cetera? But let's be honest about it. But the reality is, whilst we would all say having people back in an office creates more productivity because everyone's together and blah, blah, blah. I totally accept that and I like that and as a concept. The reality is for a lot of people now, their new habits won't allow that to happen anymore. So do you carry on fighting the fight and saying, well, what we always know productivity is about being back in the office, so let's get everyone back in the office? Or do you start trying to adapt and build businesses that can really accelerate and embrace what people are really asking for now? And we could sit here and argue till we're blue in the face that, the younger generations are more lazy and they're woke and all the words that people get bantered around and that type of stuff. The reality is that is the generation that we have. And we have to work to that if we want to maximize productivity and performance within our businesses. If we fight it all the time, we're just creating this huge revolution between us and conflict and our future employees. And the reality is, we did some research on this the other day in the UK. We are in a significant talent shortage at the moment here in the UK. It's global, it's everywhere, but it's bigger in the UK at the moment. And you don't always feel it, but we've got more people leaving our workforce than we've ever had before, less people joining our workforce than ever had before. Different skill sets we have in demand that no one's filling and no one's training people to do. And then when they're all complaining that the workers we've got aren't good enough, I say, well, before you complain about them, why don't you go and help them become better and good enough? And then we won't have so much of a problem with talent shortages.
One thought on that, James, is that one thing that strikes me about this business about the workforce and getting better is there is a tendency, and I don't know if it still goes on, you guys can tell me, but certainly in my day, there was a tendency to focus on those negatives. What are the skills we need to improve? Rather than thinking, what are the best talents of these individuals, and how do we free up the ability for them to spend more time on the things they're good at and less time on the things they're not so good at? And if we join all the peaks of performance, we'll actually get the whole organization improving. That's why I ducked out of corporate life. I decided, what do I like doing? What do I not like doing? Why don't I spend the rest of my career doing the bits I like? And I just wonder if there's an opportunity to think differently about how we develop that talent and stop thinking it's all about getting them better at things that they're not very good at, and spend more time thinking about how do we get more out of the things they are good at. Maybe I'm just naive.
Well, no, I don't think you are. I think you're quite the opposite. I think one of the most important parts of the recruitment process is called redeployment. So before you start recruiting people, think about the skills you got within your business that you can now redeploy. So you're getting people to play to their superpowers and so on and so forth, and then we talk about, and Megan, you're going to laugh at this because I said I'll mention it, but then you talk about AI coming in, and actually what does AI do? It doesn't replace people. What it does do is it supercharges people to do their job significantly better. That's really, really exciting. And in fact, I will pick on Megan on this one because we were laughing about it beforehand, but what are your thoughts from a people point of view about the relationship between AI and people? And is it a takeover, or is it actually a superpower that sits underneath? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It is a work in progress conversation, isn't it? And I think the outcome remains to be seen. But for us and our vantage right now and what we know to be true, it is a complement to how we work and what our strengths are. And particularly, I'm in the business of people, right? I think all of us are actually, and you are when you're in leadership. And one thing I believe fervently is that human currency will never be replaced by AI. So instead, let's not think about it as a threat or as something that's going to come and sort of take us over. Yes, it has powerful capabilities to do all sorts of things, but in the, speaking of strength space, what are its strengths for us and how do we leverage that to complement, what we're trying to achieve in our jobs? And it's powerful in that capacity. And we only know it's sort of minimal power right now, but gosh, this computing power, it's absolute power. We were talking about, it's starting to be able to think for us and feel emotions, etc. So how interesting. So yeah, the conversation remains to be or continued, but I think it's very complementary more than I feel it as a threat.
Yeah, I've seen it quite in a quite practical sense actually recently, James. I've been doing some work with one of the big 4 accountancy firms, and they've got a product called Smart Reviewer, which aimed at pharmaceutical companies to help them review data, because they have to double check everything before it's allowed to go into the marketplace. And interestingly enough, when you look at the benefits of this AI product they brought in, yes, part of the benefit is they can get items into the marketplace quicker because AI helps them, check for typos and errors and all that sort of stuff. But actually, when you look at the individuals that were tasked with it, that's where the real human benefits have come through. And what they're saying is, number one, it gives me more time to spend time on value-added tasks rather than spending my time sort of checking the paperwork. But number two, these are highly trained medical professionals. And what they're saying is it gives me actually more time and more ability to be respected by the organization for the real skills I bring rather than my time being wasted on other things. So they've seen it very much as an enhancement for them as individuals by taking away some of the mundane and sort of the tasks they don't want to do and actually could be done by a machine.
Good. Interesting.
Little side note now, back to you, James, actually. I was going to ask you a question sort of more broadly, but I guess it dovetails into the AI question. From a recruitment industry perspective, I've got my own views on this, but what's your view on how recruitment has stayed the same and how recruitment has changed, particularly when it comes to exec hiring?
I think the core threads of recruitment will never go away. The principles behind what recruitment is all about will never change. It's just that how it's packaged up and how it's dressed now is different. So the way if we look at an example, and this could be a random example, but it might prove a point, is that, the way we engage with people daily is very different now. Look at B2B sales. It's completely different. So how people buy and sell is very, very different from what it was 5-10 years ago. The old days, when I was around, it was like, you get a Yellow Pages out. If anyone knows what Yellow Pages is, it's a directory of telephone numbers and random names and of companies. And someone gives you a phone and you go, right, there you go and pick up the phone and call as many of those people in the Yellow Pages, start with A and try and get through to Z by the end of the year, and you've got a job still. And that's what sales was. Now it's all about nurturing. It's about building relationships and trust. It's about marketing led first and so on and so forth. So that whole process has changed. And if you think about recruitment, it is a sales journey. It's a B2B, B2C, however you want to do it, journey where I'm selling to an executive to kind of want to move into a new job, etc. So the principles of how that's evolved and changed should be now brought into how recruiters engage with talent and engage with their customer base, as far as I'm concerned, and their stakeholders. So it's sort of big picture answer to your question, Chris, but the principles of recruitment haven't changed. It's the way we go about it now have definitely changed. And that's because we just do things differently now. I remember as a headhunter, going back many years ago, I used to work in the Australian market, and headhunting was all about you pick up the phone at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the evening, because you couldn't speak to people during the day because they were, funnily enough, at work. Now, most people are working at home on a Friday lunchtime, so I can headhunt at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock on a Friday morning, and actually someone can take my call because they're working from home in their pants or whatever, pretending they're on a Zoom call type thing. And you can actually do your headhunting calls then. So, it's just adapting to the world that we live in now, but the principle's still the same, and it's all about, as very much to Megan's point, it's about that sort of the USP of business is about how human are you, and recruitment is all about being human. If you can't build trust and rapport and relationships, you'll never be a good recruiter, as far as I'm concerned.
James, what's the balance? Sorry, Chris, I was going to ask just a question to James. James, what's the balance nowadays? Has it shifted between kind of, as I almost say, like in consumer goods, there were 2 types of selling. You're knocking on doors trying to persuade somebody to buy your product, or they know so much about it that when they walk into the supermarket, they see it on the shelf and they want to buy it. I'm just interested in the same balance in recruitment. To what extent is it people knocking the door? I got my job at BA because I wrote to them saying, I'd really love to work for BA. Whereas traditional, when you think of headhunting, you think of people, recruiters actually phoning up people and trying to persuade them. And is there a balance shift there between?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because one of the questions you have to help answer that is, what's the shift, the split between active job seekers and passive job seekers? And if you look at all the data, they generally predict around about 85 to 90% of all workers are actually active job seekers now.
Wow.
So that doesn't mean they're necessarily replying to adverts and picking up the phone to recruiters and doing all that type of stuff, but it means they're very willing to receive a call from a recruiter to say there's an opportunity. So that's like, there's only 10% of people who's basically saying, I'm happy where I am, leave me alone. 90% are actually willing to move. So then that becomes this piece of, well, what does somebody who is, let's call them an active passive candidate job seeker, who is, I'm busy looking at work, doing my job, looking good, but at the same time, I want to make sure I'm known to be out there on the marketplace. I can't change my LinkedIn profile to say, currently out of work or looking for a job. But what I can do, I can spend a little bit more time networking with my future employers by doing this and doing that and doing etc. And that's where LinkedIn plays its part and everything else. So again, that's a classic example. And you're absolutely right of how it's shifted, I think.
I think what that does, to your point, is it mirrors what we know to be true about the job market and our operating models and everything in this day and age, which is everything is sort of becoming more hybrid. So it's less binary, it's less active or passive, and it's everyone's a little bit more hybrid in the way that they approach their career, the future of their career, their development, etc. So I see it as a direct mirror of what we understand to be true.
And do you think, Megan, there is, I'm going to use this word very carefully when I say this, and this is sorry, Megan and Chris about that, but do you think there is less loyalty now of workers to a particular job? And so that, we talk a lot about people job hopping and moving around a lot more, and they say they're doing it to evolve their CV and their skill set. But actually, is it because actually they just get bored and want to move on and there's no real loyalty anymore?
Yeah, I don't know if it's that simple. I think that the market these days, the norms have changed. If we know anything to be true, it's that change is constant. I think that the norms in the job market have changed. And so it's less about, are you loyal? And it's more about, it's normal in the job market to gain experience through different exposures and to move faster and to move quicker and to be open as this kind of hybrid candidate that's both active and passive and those kinds of things. So I think that it's an evolution, and not so much that, loyalty has diminished, but it's just different behaviors. I can be very loyal to my company as it exists today and still be open-minded about my future, and therefore still want to network and take calls and meet really great people and explore ideas and share ideas together. And oftentimes, you guys know this in the recruitment world, your next step in your career comes from those opportunities. It rarely comes from you applying for a job. It comes from this sort of economy of network that you grow over time. And so, yeah, I think the conversation has changed.
I wonder if when it's funny, interesting, when we talk about loyal, we always talk about it in terms of the employee's loyalty to the organization. And I think picking up on what you were saying earlier on about motivations, James, I wonder if the other way of looking at it is, what's the organization's loyalty to the employee? Maybe we should be looking at that, because if they get that bit right, then the employee will stay. And, if you look at, I changed jobs, I've changed enough times to know that, when I changed, it wasn't because I didn't like the organization. I loved working for Procter & Gamble. I'm still very loyal to British Airways, but I moved because there was something exciting somewhere else. For me personally, that was motivating, not because I was trying to pick up Megan's point, not because I was being disloyal. It was just, there was another career opportunity that I couldn't get where I was.
And so we have to create that as leaders. We have to create that continuous removal of a glass ceiling. Absolutely right. So.
And we've got to understand what motivates our people. And back to your comment earlier on, you've got to understand that bit about what turns them on. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What do they like? What do they not like? What do they think they're good at? What do they not think they're good at? Those sorts of things are far more important than how are they performing in their job at the moment, if you want to keep them.
I agree.
Megan, sorry, I cut across you there.
No, I was just going to say, reflecting on, loyalty, I think used to be considered as a time or a tenure number, a metric, right? But I think that, to Hamish's point, loyalty can exist in perpetuity if both parties have had a great experience and have been treated well and have been tapped into the motivations, etc. And in the recruitment world, you guys probably see this. Sometimes people cycle back because of their loyalty, right? So they move on and then they boomerang and they come back. And so, it can't necessarily just have an end date to it because of a certain or set amount of time, but rather, again, back to the human and sort of psychology dimension, it can exist in perpetuity even when people move on.
I've seen a different approach as well. We talked earlier about, I think, I can't remember who said it now, maybe yourself, James, talking about networking, finding different, that's what it was you, James, talking about different ways that people want to kind of open up let people know that they're maybe considering something else, but don't want to be too overt about it. Like obviously one of the shifts that we've also seen very much on the front lines is the fact that people don't respond like they did even a few years ago to just, straightforward approaches, probably because of AI bots and the sheer volume of emails coming through from recruiters and indeed the rest of the world. So I think one thing that we've had to adapt to is actually how you meet these people, particularly at a senior level, and how do you actually get that relationship and really build that network, I would argue is probably even more important than it was a few years ago when, as a recruiter, you could kind of rely a little bit more on LinkedIn or a little bit more on sort of fairly straightforward outreach just to get, good people to turn their heads in the first place. What do you think, James, on that?
I definitely agree. And this is why I think recruiters play such an important role, because, a recruiter creates that network, nurtures that network for you, and introduces that sort of stuff, which I think is hugely important. But, but it's like anything, isn't it? I mean, if you think about, when you book a holiday now, as an example, no one just goes onto a website, sees a holiday and books it. You go, there's a holiday, that looks interesting. I'm not going to go and ask a bunch of people what they think and get their thoughts and ideas and that type of stuff. So we're so used now, habitually used to asking people's opinions. What do you think? What would you suggest I do? And that peer-to-peer type environment of a network, I think, is a real driver when it comes to recruitment. I'm absolutely convinced by it. Recruiters enable that to all happen, and they link it all together really nicely, which is brilliant, which is a big part. I was chatting to someone yesterday and they was talking about how they become a thought leader in their market. I said, stop trying to become a thought leader in your market. You're never going to become a thought leader, but instead become an enabler, an aggregator, a networker. That's what people want from a recruiter. I don't want a thought leader. I just want someone who knows everyone and can move the pieces around for me.
Can I pick up on that enabler thought? Because I've got a challenge for the recruitment industry as a customer point of view, and it brings back to the sort of customer-led transformation thing. Look, to me, recruitment is what you do. I don't want a recruiter. I want somebody who's going to enhance my success of my business or in my role. By finding me the right support. But the goal I'm after is not to recruit somebody. The goal is to enhance my success. So I wonder if there's a redefinition of the title. Almost stop calling it the recruitment business. The business you're in is enhancing my success. It's a bit like I did some work with some banks where they were looking at working with small companies, and they realized that the small company was interested in their ambition. So they said, right, we're not a bank manager anymore now, we're an ambition manager. Our job's to help you achieve your ambition. And I wonder if there's a mindset thing somewhere there in recruitment that at the moment, recruitment, that's kind of what you do rather than the success that I get because you do it brilliantly.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. The trouble is, as an agency recruiter, if you start talking like that, everyone's saying you're just denying the fact you're a recruiter. You're trying to hide it, aren't you? So, so it's an impossible. I agree with you, though, totally. And we call a lot of the companies we work with, we call them their talent management businesses. And then what's that about? It's about improving the productivity performance of your talent. And how does that work? Well, we help you with engagement, motivation, retention, hiring, redeployment, training, et cetera, et cetera. So totally with you, but you've got to be careful in our world. Everyone's so cynical about recruiters half the time.
Again, let me challenge there. I want to go out to them and tell them stop calling themselves talent managers and call themselves talent enhancers or talent developers, because it's about it's the result that we're going to get as a result of it. We're brilliant.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Definitely agree with that. 100%.
I think it's also there's a dynamic thing here as well, because in my experience, you get involved in an exec search or a recruitment piece of work, whatever it might be, and usually there's this kind of pre-written understanding that the hiring manager, whoever that may be, will give the requirements to the recruiter. The recruiter will go out and find what they're looking for, and that's the job of the recruiter. And I think something that the recruitment industry actually in itself is improving on a lot, but still has a little way to go, is playing that role of stopping the behavior of their own customer and saying, no, don't treat me like that. I guess to your point, Hamish, a little bit, how do we reframe that a little bit? How do we sort of help the customer side or the person hiring, how to change their mindset on what they actually need from their recruiter or whatever we call them?
Well, that starts immediately, whether you're an in-house recruiter or whether you're an agency recruiter, shifting the dial from being a supplier to a partner. And that is the first step that you have to do. So every recruitment company I work with, I say to them, you are a recruiter. I said, you are not a supplier to your customers. You are in a partnership, and the customer has to behave in the right way in order to be able to complete the transaction and vice versa. If you're an internal recruiter, working in HR, you partner your hiring managers, and they have to behave and pull their heads in as much as you need to do your job. That's just the reality.
Mm. Yeah, can I just add to that point? So my background many years ago was all in-house recruitment, and it is amazing how differently the in-house recruitment team get treated versus an external recruiter from the initial get-go. And that's, I think, the first challenge from an external recruiter is to change that behavior and that dynamic in the first place, which is one of the hardest things to overcome, I think.
I think the fastest way to do that is to add value right away by understanding people's motivations in hiring and what their key success factors will be, to Hamish's point. And the best tools to do that is really through business coaching, right? We want to partner, we want to coach, that we as hiring people can open our minds to the experience of what's actually happening in the market and what do the candidates want at this time. And so there is that sort of dynamic where you're collaborating together. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a whole process there, Megan. I think you're right. I mean, it starts off with, yes, the bit I said about, understand what success means to me and what I'm like, so that you know what it would be like, etc. There's an education piece, as you say, about what's going on in the marketplace that could help me at that stage. But then down the track as well, one of the things we talked about last time when we were on with Chris was what happens after the recruitment as well. Because at the end of the day, it's only success if the person's still there 6 months later and doing a great job for me. So what role can the recruiter play in actually the embedding, the moving on over the first kind of 12 months of a new role as well? And if you can start right at the very beginning in sort of challenging the spec and understanding my success, right the way through to a year later that you've helped the person succeed, that to me is what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for just give you a spec, you find me a person. I think that's too narrow a definition of the value you guys can add.
One of my favorite questions to candidates when we're sitting down and getting to that point is, if we're sitting down from here together 12 months from now, what has to have happened over the past 12 months for you from a values perspective, accomplishment perspective, to in that coffee make you say to me, this was a great career choice for me. This was absolutely it. I made the right choice for myself, and get them to share with us what their key success factors are. So yeah, it's a two-way street for sure.
Yeah. And it's great because then getting back to where James started off about the motivations, you're being an enhancer for them rather than always seen as they're going to here to enhance my my business. You're actually saying, how can I actually enhance you and your career and what you actually want? And then you get that mutual thing going, which is great.
I'm just a little bit mindful of time now. I think we're coming up to time. If anyone's got any other questions, please do pop them in the chat or jump in now if anyone has anything to add. Otherwise, just whilst I give you guys some time to pop anything else into the chat that you'd like, let me just share my screen again. I just want to remind everyone, as I did at the beginning of this, that if you would like to continue the conversation with us, do click on the QR code that you should see on your screen there. There's a link there to follow up with a conversation with Hamish. You can also speak with James, myself, and also Megan. So just have a little look at the QR code and fill in the form. You can also join the community as well by scanning the QR code and popping in your details. So if you would like additional content, and also James, I know you said you'd be kind enough to send around the presentation from the beginning of your session as well, then we can share it with everyone as well.
Great.
I don't think there's any other questions. So I just want to say thank you all very much for joining today. And thanks again to Hamish and Megan. And thanks to you, James. I know you've been on some of our other sessions, but thanks again for joining. And thanks to everyone else for attending. And we will see you on the next one.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much for inviting us, and good luck, everybody.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.